live in South Dakota. For Keystone XL, they're going to be putting them in temporary work camps, and they'll bring in RVs and they'll just live in those. So, most of the jobs will go to out-of-state folks. Next slide. So, there's choices, and we can talk about these later, but, on the one hand, you can have Keystone system, which results in higher prices at the pump, greater safety risks. There's a lot of destruction and pollution in Canada that impacts to the land of the U.S. Probably a lot of you know these things. On the other hand, there are alternatives, and we need, as a community, I think, to commit to those alternatives. Next slide, please. So anyway, I want to wrap up. I also want to say, just as an introduction to later speakers, that you hear people say that there's nothing states and counties can do. Well, the truth of the matter is that both Montana, South Dakota, and Minnesota all have siting laws. Montana and Minnesota, I believe, route. I know Montana does. I don't practice in Minnesota. They actually can say where the pipeline goes. So states do have control over certain aspects of pipeline development, as do counties. Counties where states don't act, counties usually have authority to control certain aspects of pipelines too. And now this really isn't a question of doubt, because these other states have had these laws for a long time, and TransCanda went through the regulatory process. Nebraska does not have a state law on this, but that doesn't mean that counties can't act, probably. And it also means that the state could act. And there are a variety of ways that the state could act to protect the economic interests of its citizens. Also, I think that the state could be more involved with pipeline safety if it wanted to, because the federal government encourages states to be involved in a lot of its activities. It doesn't mean the states can control the feds, but it does mean that the states have a right to say that, to help make sure that federal law is implemented fully and responsibly to protect citizens. So I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Paul. Our next speaker is going to be Duane with the Nebraska Wildlife Federation. But before Duane comes up, I just want to remind folks at home that you can tweet in your questions at Bold Nebraska, or email your questions to actions@boldnebraska.org. And we also have all of the materials that presenters are giving tonight. So if you're at home, you don't have these in front of you, but they all of the materials are online at boldnebraska.org. We have a page specifically dedicated to more research, PDFs of reports and information that even Senator Nelson and Representative Fortenberry sent in to the Secretary of State. So there is resources on boldnebraska.org for you. So Duane.
Well, thanks. Thanks for all of you who are here and all the folks out there in Wetland who are listening in and watching. Duane Hovorka with the Nebraska Wildlife Federation. We're the state affiliate of the National Wildlife Federation, which is one of the more active groups nationally that's working on these kinds of issues. National Wildlife Federation has also been one of the leading groups working for clean energy and climate legislation at the federal level. So if you grew up with Ranger Rick, or your big backyard, or you get National Wildlife Magazine, that's National Wildlife Federation. And if you get the Prairie Blade, that means you're a Nebraska Wildlife Federation member. We love our members because they provide contributions that allow us to do this kind of work. And so pick up a newsletter on your way out for the folks here. We also have something called a Wildlife Action Network. It's an email alert system. We provide you with a free email about every week or two that's got just hits the highlights of what's going on in terms of state and federal legislation that affects wildlife. There's some cards here, or you can just sign on our website, www.nebraskawildlife.org, and we'd be glad to put you on our list. What I want to do today is just hit the highlights of what the pipeline looks like from a wildlife perspective. I'm just going to hit the highlights. If you'd like to see more details on our website, we have our comments are posted. We've also got the much longer comments that were put together by the National Wildlife Federation and a whole lot of other groups together. So let's go to the first slide here. You've seen this. This is just to give you an idea of where the thing is in Nebraska. And one of the things to really recognize is that we're cutting basically through the heart of the Nebraska sandhills. It's a pretty fragile soils that are up there. This is not the clay soils of eastern Nebraska that the Keystone XL Pipeline went through. These are sandhill soils. They're basically stabilized sand dunes. And once those dunes get disturbed, once the native grasses on there get disturbed, you can get a blowout. And you can see your sand dune basically moving a half mile to the east in a fairly short amount of time. So that's one of our concerns about this. We have a very fragile ecosystem, very fragile soils up in the sandhills. And first we're going to disturb them to bury the pipeline. And there are questions now about how fast that native grass or the grass they plant will regrow, because you can still see the scars from the center pivots that were put in there in the 1970s and abandoned not long after that. You can still see those scars on the land even today. So that's one of our concerns. Next slide. This is the Ogallala Aquifer. That's where most of Nebraskans get our drinking water. We really rely on it for agriculture. We also rely on it because it feeds a lot of those streams in the Niobrara, the Platte system, and the others. And what you can see up there, that blue line is roughly where the pipeline is going to go. So not only are we cutting through the heart of the sandhills, we're cutting right across, right in, right over the Ogallala Aquifer. So that's a second major concern that we have. If you look at how much of that pipeline is going to be in areas where the water is at or near the surface or within 50 feet of the surface, you know, that's a pretty fragile place to put a pipeline. Next slide. So give you an idea of what one of those sandhills blowouts looks like. And you can see on the picture on the right up at the top, that cap of green is the native grass that typically covers these. It hasn't always covered them. These are very mobile systems. And then what you see there are some people down there in the bottom of that blowout. And on the left side you see actually it's a blowout penstemon, which is one of the rare species we have there. But this will just give you a sense of what that landscape looks like up in the sandhills. Next slide. This is from the draft environmental impact statement. Give you an idea of how that pipeline itself is going to change the terrain. That we're looking at increases in soil temperature at the surface based on a pipeline that's buried 4 or 5 feet in the ground at 4 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit during parts of the year. Increases 6 inches below 10 to 15 degrees, closer to the pipeline down around 6 feet of about 40 degrees. Well, if you look at those prairie plants, they have some pretty deep roots that go down easily that far. So again, you're going to change that microclimate right over the pipeline, and we're not really sure what that's going to do in terms of that ground cover, in terms of the potential for blowouts. And if you look at the climate wizard that the Nature Conservancy put together, we look at sort of the mid-range, what's climate change going to do in Nebraska. You're talking about an average increase in our state of roughly 5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit during the summer months by around 2050. So we're still in the useful life of the pipeline. We really haven't done the research to know what that's going to do in terms of those sandhills. You're obviously going to get more soil moisture evaporating because you're going to have higher summer temperatures. We don't know what that may do in terms of those sandhills, in terms of mobilizing those soils and causing more blowouts. The wetlands, we've got wetlands as special concern, both in the sandhills and in the rainwater basin. The pipeline sponsors say that they're going to rely on the Corps of Engineers, which has a wetland permitting system. The Nebraska Game Parks Commission says about 2/3 of Nebraska wetlands are not included in that federal system, so they're not covered. What they are covered by is a state system, and in our state system we don't have a wetland permitting system in our state. So we don't have what some other states have. What we do have is a voluntary consultation provision so that landowners can go in, they can ask our Department of Environmental Quality for some recommendations on what they could do in order to mitigate impacts of destruction or draining or of wetlands. But again, there's really not anybody out there enforcing it. There's very few resources committed to it. So we're not convinced that ultimately those wetlands in Nebraska are really going to be protected. This will give you an idea of the other flavor of our concerns. One is what's going to happen locally in Nebraska, and we've seen some of those concerns. If you look at where those tar sands are up in north central Alberta, and you go north from there, you run into a place called the Wood Buffalo National Park, a very remote park. What you may not realize is that the only wild flock of migrating whooping cranes, about 265, and this is a bird, there's basically about 400 whooping cranes left alive in the world. They migrate through Nebraska on their way to the Texas Gulf Coast where they spend the winter. Well, in the summer they nest up in the northeast part of Wood Buffalo National Park, all of them. So it's a very critical area up there. It's downstream from the tar sands area. So not only do you have the potential for the damage that could be done to the birds as they migrate over the area that you saw the pictures earlier, you have that potential, You also have the potential that the massive amounts of water that are used on site, that are used in the process, are going to change that geology there. We know in Nebraska how much changing groundwater can change our surface water flows because we're dealing with it on the Republican and the Platte and the other rivers. Well, it's a very shallow water system, a lot of wetlands. That's what supports those whooping cranes. So there's certainly at least a risk there that we're going to start to mess up that, that water system that those birds and that the other wildlife, the other birds that migrate and the other wildlife that depend on it, depend on. Closer to home, Nebraska Public Power District is then asked to build 3 new large transmission lines in order to supply power to 3 pumping stations in the state. All 3 of those are right through the heart of the Central Flyway. All 3 of those are within basically the 100-mile corridor that those whooping cranes use to migrate. So you get those big big power lines up there, that's a risk to wildlife. They're supposed to be paid for over time. Nebraska Public Power District ratepayers will pay the money in order to put the transmission lines in, and then the pipeline folks, the Keystone folks, will pay for that over time through their electric rates. Well, that's all well and good if the pipeline is actually built, if it's running at full capacity, if it's buying power for those pumps, if the thing stays around for many years, the Nebraska Public Power District folks will get paid back. But what happens if they don't? What happens if those projections about oil demand are closer to what we think they'll be rather than what they're betting that they'll be at the pipeline? There's a real risk there that Nebraska Public Power District ratepayers are taking on to build those transmission lines. So there's not only risk to wildlife, there's risk to ratepayers that they may or may not get the money back from building those lines. The river crossings, we're talking about the Niobrara, the Platte, the Loop. Some of those already suffer from low dissolved oxygen, and so doing construction in those areas could cause some problems. There's always potential when you're moving equipment up and down a corridor that's hundreds of miles long that you're going to move invasive species back and forth in the tires or in the wheel wells or as part in the water that they're going to use to test it. So things like zebra mussels, purple loosestrife, invasive species like those, certainly we've got some potential there for those to be transmitted, for those to be introduced into Nebraska in places they are not already here. And of course we have the potential, if there is a leak, if it is near one of those streams, to get into a real high value waterway like the Central Platte River. The climate change implications, they're real, they're important. You heard from Paul about what's going on up in Canada. And so the destruction of the forests and all those arguments, I think Paul's probably already covered that already, but that's, again, one of our concerns.